humans would be have confined to a small area in Africa had they not developed fire. But fire cannot be fueled except by wood. And so the whole idea of humanity, without wood would be um, unthinkable. And also the fact that people had fire, they could change night into day with light. They could also, and this is a point a lot of people miss, is that once they had fires, they could sit around and start to talk, and a language developed because of wood fuel. And also, all the implements that people use are basically unable, don't work unless you have wooden handles.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or evening or whatever time of day it is, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to this 23rd webinar in the Life Saves the Planet series, co-hosted by Biodiversity for a Livable Climate and the GBH Forum Network. So today, we are honored to present John Perlin, author of A Forest Journey, The Role of Trees in the Fate of Civilization, published in February 2023 by Patagonia. This is the third edition of the book. Its earliest iteration in 2005 was heralded by Harvard as a classic in science and world history and one of the 100 books everybody should have on their shelf. The book looks at the history of human civilizations on this planet from the Sumerians to today. And John Perlin, who did extensive both research and field work and has been to every place that is mentioned in the book, basically learned how the abundance or the scarcity of wood shaped in large part every civilization's culture, demographics, foreign affairs, economy, politics, and technology, and ultimately its fate. This new edition includes research about essentially what people who've been to earlier webinars that we've presented in this series, the biotic pump function of trees in creating and distributing rain across the planet, making possible a livable climate. That has been included in both chapters at the end of the book, but also in looking again at the entire book. Basically, the fate of civilization today rests, as John Perlin will explain, on leaving the trees standing. John is going to be joined in conversation by Paul Hughes, who is director of the Forever Forest Foundation, based in California and focused very much on protecting the great redwoods there. And John and Paul are going to have a very interesting conversation before we start to present your questions. And so now I'm just going to say, welcome to John Perlin, an adventurer, a scholar, and a terrific storyteller. I am sure you're going to really enjoy this.
Well, thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you, John.
So we're going to do a short slideshow giving your audience a little bit of a taste for the many images that are included in the book. Now, the book actually, the new book starts 385 million years ago with the first true tree. And what makes a true tree is large roots, as we see these fossilized roots in this image, a trunk, and branches and leaves, which Archaeopteryx, the first true tree, had. And now what the tree serviced, you might say, the environment, is that it brought photosynthesis to the picture, where the tree took down tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide and exuded large amounts of oxygen, which basically changed the entire world. And the reason why it changed the world was because there was only one continent, and the tree spread everywhere. For example, today fossils of this tree are found in Oklahoma, in Pennsylvania, in New York, and then Ireland, Belgium, and actually the greatest number of trunks were found in southern Morocco. Next slide, please. And here we see yours truly, the author, boots on the ground, digging up many fossils. And here, for example, is 380 million year old bark, which I dug up at this spot in western Pennsylvania called Red Hill. And in my living room, I have zillions of fossils I brought home of the leaves. And actually, one of the most interesting fossils is charcoal, because for the first time, there was sufficient oxygen in the air. It allowed for ignition and created the first forest fires. And that resulted in charcoal remains. And what's amazing is the charcoal, if you rub your finger on it, it smears just as if you are smearing your finger on a campfire that existed, was put out just 24 hours ago, even though this charcoal is so ancient. And so Archaeopteryx basically changed the world and provided the terrestrial environment for large creatures to come on land, and created the ambience that today allows us to survive. Next slide, please. Then after I discuss Archaeopteryx, I begin with the first great tree cutter of history, and this is Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk, which was the first flag was planted of civilization. And he was like all civilizers. He wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted to build a great city. So he required tremendous amounts of wood. So against the gods who made the forest their abode, he said he was going to attack the cedar forest. So he led his men with huge axes to cut down the cedar forest, and the gods fled to heaven, and the trees from Iran to Israel started to cry because they knew what their fate would be. And what's interesting about the Gilgamesh story, it's the first story extant that we have of a great adventure, is that as they were going down the river with their trunks, his follower Enkidu looked at Gilgamesh and he said, "I think we've turned our forest into a wasteland. What will our gods think?" So here we have the first, you might say, thoughts toward an ecological future. Next slide. This bas relief was found in Khorassabad, a future Gilgamesh, about 1,000 years later. We're talking about maybe 4,000 years ago. Had to take even a longer forest journey because they had deforested the entire Middle East. So they had to go westward. And one of the fascinating aspects, I think, of a forest journey, which I learned, was we have a constant westward movement from the Middle East, eventually all the way to North America in search of sufficient timber. And here we see, you can see the logs are being carried from sea to land, and it supplied the future Gilgameshes with the wood they needed to build their great edifices. Next slide, please. And the consequence was the great cedars of Lebanon, where Gilgamesh was attracted to and future Gilgameshes went, suddenly became bereft of wood with only a few acres left when at one time it was a vast woodland where thousands and thousands of elephants roamed. Now, this might seem to you a fairy tale, but later archaeologists have found giant elephant bones all over the Middle East. And this was because at one time, all the hills above Iran, Iraq, in southern Turkey, and in Israel were all forested and provided a habitat that no longer exists. And because the habitat no longer exists, the elephants no longer exist. Next slide. And here we see why the trees got cut down. These are the tree cutters with their axes. The Neanderthals used wood for handles to make their tree cutting more effective. And from that day on, it was goodbye to our forested earth. Next slide. And this is very typical. We see this happening in Africa today. We see what I call a forest journey. In fact, a colleague once remarked when I showed this slide that looked just like his trips to various African countries. Here we see in Europe from the 14th century, this woodcut of people coming from the forest with the gold that kept them warm at night, especially in wintertime, and also allowed them to have really good meals. Next slide. Much of the wood was turned into charcoal. Now, charcoal burns at a higher fuel and a more guaranteed temperature. Charcoal allowed us to go into the Middle Ages. We talk about the ages iron and copper and bronze, but in truth, it's really the wood age, or you might say the charcoal age, because without the heat, you would have had no metals, because most of the ore is like maybe 10% metal. And so you have to have a high flame to extract the metal for it to be usable. And not only was charcoal used for making metal possible, but also ceramics, which were necessary for eating, for transporting goods, and for civilization. So it's not a very dubious assumption, and that's what I show in the book, that without wood, there would be no civilization. Next slide, please. And not only wood was used for fuel, but it also was used for all means of transportation. Here we see construction from lumber, the wheelwrights. And so you would, in fact, the North American Indians called the wagons that the settlers moved from, say, from the Mississippi to Oregon to California. They called them wood on wheels, just to show you how important it was. In fact, yesterday I watched a Western, and I saw how essential wood was, reinforced my idea of how essential wood is, because even the teepees require the structural material used wood. And not only was it provided for land transport, but just think of this, for thousands of years until the ironclads went to it in the Civil War, every ship was made of wood. In fact, for example, England would have never existed as a powerhouse throughout the last, say, 300, 400 years, if not for wood. And the English admitted it by calling its protection and its wealth the wooden walls of England. Next slide, please. Now, in California was the as I mentioned, civilization moved westward, and once people deforested the eastern seaboard, the eastern forest was so immense that people said a squirrel could travel from the coast, Atlantic coast, all the way to the Mississippi without touching ground. And it was comparable to the Great Amazon. So by the 1850s, there was no more great forests in the East Coast. So people went to California, where everything is always much bigger. And here we see the kill of a great redwood that was accomplished in the 1890s. Next slide, please. And as machinery developed, the forests were even greaterly threatened, because instead of being limited by transport by boat, say, which required to be near a river, you had machines, first the railroads, then the other mechanized implements going even further in the forest. And who gave a damn about the forest when there was lots of money to be made? And this is actually the tragedy of humanity, is all we thought of was the wood and not the trees. And thank you very much, Andrew. So let me add, so this gives you a visual taste for what a forest journey contains. I'd like to add that the new book actually contains, I would say at least 60 more images of each period. And a lot of it is in color for the first time, which I think everyone will agree makes for a very beautiful book.
Okay. I believe that's my cue to start asking John a few questions. And I will wait to be interrupted by our stage managers if that's not the case. I'm going to dive right in here.
Okay, I'm ready.
Great to be with you, John. I was introduced to this book 30 years ago. I read, it was on a list of recommended books, and when I read it, I knew it was one of the most important books about forests ever written. And that's been echoed by critics and scholars ever since. The core idea seems like such a simple one. The world's greatest civilizations have tended to rise in power and prominence when they had abundant forest resources readily available to them. And these same societies declined and fell when they depleted or even eliminated their forests. The power of this correlation seems obvious to most anyone when they read your book, John, and yet this idea hasn't been put together in quite the same way before now. Tell us, if you would, what sparked the idea for you to write the book?
Well, I was finishing the research and the writing for my first book called The Golden Thread, 2,500 Years of Solar Architecture and Technology, which has morphed into a more recent book called Let It Shine, the 6,000-year story of solar energy. And so what I discovered was when people turned to the sun, it was because they were running out of wood. And so they needed a new means of heating. And the only mechanism they could come up with was designing cities and homes to use the solar heat of the sun. And so I asked the question, if people are changing their entire way of heating because of wood shortages, wood indeed must have played a great role in the development of civilization, just like petroleum, for example, plays such a crucial role at this moment in our world. And so with that idea, I began to do the research, and I didn't actually know that this would consume decades of my life.
And hopefully it'll consume decades more of other people's lives now that they have some additional guidance of what we need to do. I want to dive into some of the specific societies throughout history and their relation to forests. But John, first let's remind everyone of the many things the ancients used wood for, ranging from obvious things to those that readers may not have realized were forest-derived or of vital importance. My list includes farm and household implements. Interrupt me here if you like. Building materials, wagons and carts, to weapons from bows and arrows, spears and catapults, breastworks, battlements and fortifications, siege towers, to timber for mining, water wheels, barrels and casks for industrial and commercial use, for making and transporting beer in barrels and casks, looms to make cloth. The early machines of the Industrial Revolution were of wood. And then on to fuel. A lot of folks don't think immediately how important fuel was. John touched on charcoal, everything from firing limestone to make lime-based concrete, to firing bricks and tiles, smelting metals, and on to ships for hull planks, masts, tar, and pitch. We could add to the list all day, but let's start with Rome, which is perhaps the best known of the ancient civilizations, or at least best publicized.
Well, Paul, yes. I'd like to add a few things. When you consider how important it is to stay warm, there would have been no migration, for example, from Africa to settle in more, we might say euphemistically, temperate places like, for example, Europe, or, for example, China, or or even the Middle East gets really, really cold. And so humans would have confined to a small area in Africa had they not developed fire. But fire cannot be fueled except by wood. And so the whole idea of humanity, without wood would be unthinkable. And also the fact that people had fire, they could change night into day with light. They could also, and this is a very a point a lot of people miss, is that once they had fires, they could sit around and start to talk, and a language developed because of wood fuel. And also all the implements that people use are basically unable, don't work unless you have wooden handles. For example, as I earlier mentioned, the axe. Can you imagine trying to cut down a tree with a rock and no handle, or to say clean a hunted deer with a knife without any handle? This would be unthinkable. And so the wooden handle basically transformed civilization into what they call the Neolithic. And then when we get to say Uruk, or the first times of days of civilization, they were all based on metals. So like you said, like the implements for war. Actually, Jack London says it very succinctly that iron always defeats stone, meaning, the conquest of the West with in view of, say, for example, Alaska, or another example, in North America or anywhere. And in fact, all these metallurgical developments, without wood, they would have been impossible. So I like to tell people that we live in a wooden age still, at least for the last, say, 5,000 years until the advent of fossil fuels. But I think what is really interesting is that the scarcity in England of trees for fuel brought about the use of fossil fuels and introduced us into what we call the age of fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of folks don't realize until they read your book that some of the materials that ancient civilizations used were made of things like concrete and brick. For example, in Rome, as I was beginning to segue into Rome, we have learned that a lot of the aqueducts and even the Colosseum and such big public buildings were made of concrete. Tell us, John, a little about how concrete and brick are made using wood, and how those materials evolved and played a role in the rise and fall of Rome.
Well, actually, I'd like to once again add that this is not only true of Rome, but also all the other civilizations that I discuss in the book. First of all, your structure of a building, as you see, like when the suburbs are being built here in, say, Santa Barbara, they require infrastructure of wood, right? So that's just the beginning. Then also you take the concrete, for example, that just doesn't appear freely. What you have to do is you have to heat what's called limestone to create a what they call lime. And that not only requires lots of wood, but also releases a lot of carbon dioxide, because it's the limestone sequesters carbon, while creating concrete, for example, creates carbon in the chemical equation. And so, for example, the aqueducts would have been unusable if it hadn't been for the lime, what we call mortar, to fit the various stones together. As an example, the baths of Rome, which are extremely famous, right? They ate up like timber after huge trunks. In fact, they had, just like we had we have a fleet of oil tankers that always are about. The Romans had 500 ships called navicolari lignari, which meant wood ships that would scour the Mediterranean for wood supplies for Rome to flourish. And now this will seem like a fairy tale, but where did this wood come from? It came mainly from North Africa, where you don't see very much wood today, creating what they call desertification, because you no longer have the trees to protect against the sand accumulations in that area. And also in France, too. I mean, I've been to France. It's totally like clear cut. And that used to be a center for wood supplies for Rome. And that's, as I said, that actually, it's the Roman experience that first got me interested in doing a forest journey, because they quickly realizing how much waste was created for using trunks to heat their baths to 120 degrees. They decided to use glass to trap solar heat to heat the baths, which actually have been found in studies about 20, 30 years ago to provide on a sunny day in winter all the heat needed for the baths. So this is actually, I'm glad you asked that, because it was the wood shortages that created the solar aspects of my studies that led me to a forest journey.
Yes, and I believe you have, your book is sprinkled with some lovely quotes, including a writer from the time who says, the baths were not hot, they were on fire. And he was complaining about how hot the baths were kept. Staying with Rome a second, one of the arcs that you trace that points out the civilization's decline was the amount of base metal in coins, the currency of the time, silver coinage, That changed, and largely due to the amount of silver, smelted silver and base metal. Can you say a little about that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question because both Greece and Rome depended on silver to have a hard currency, I guess you would say it. And so in Greece, for example, it was the mines of Laurium that actually produced enough silver so the Greeks were able to buy the wood to create the fleet that defeated the Persians at Salome. In fact, had they not had the silver to finance the building of these ships, which was also of wood, right? We would be speaking Persian today. And so with the defeat of Persia, we are what we call a Western civilization. And so now you see the significance of wood as a fuel for metallurgy, because the silver only consists of 2 to 3% of the ore. So you have to smelt it. And the same thing happened in Rome. Rome actually conquered Spain for its silver. You had what's called the Rio Tinto, which divides Portugal and Spain, and it's that area which was silver rich. And so I forgot, I don't have the numbers right offhand, but it basically deforested Spain. So as the wood ran out, you had problems with the currency, and you had to go to places like Cyprus for the copper to create your coinage.
Yeah, and as the amount of pure metal, particular silver, but also gold, began to decline as a proportion of a silver or gold coin, and more base metal, which was easier to incorporate into a coin because it took less charcoal smelting fuel, the confidence in the currency declined, and thereby led to a decline in the civilization itself.
Well, actually, right? Yeah, well, but actually, we have other signals too. For example, the size of the tiles changed as people had less access to forests. And the problem this created too, remember, is the fact that Rome depended on far away areas for its wood and for its resources. And this created difficulties to protect those boundaries, where you need more and more legionnaires. And that created actually what's happening today, where in the oil-rich countries, they wield a disproportionate amount of power because they hold the fuel. And it was the same back in the days of the Romans, when places like England were the depots, you might say, of iron for the Romans, but the only way they could get that iron was through smelting rock, which required wood fuel.
And one of the interesting areas in which you shine a light in your book is that civilizations in Asia Minor, city-states in Asia Minor, such as Troy, that's in modern-day western coastal Turkey, were originally documented as having been coastal cities, but it was found later in the archaeological record that those cities weren't where the ancient documents said they were. Can you say a little about your trip to Troy and where you found it, where it was expected to be, and why that location of ancient Troy had changed?
Well, what was interesting is that until the 20th century, people believed that the Iliad was just a fairy tale, because they talked about battles around Troy on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until the Troy was unearthed that fiction became fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent like a week camped out about 800 meters from Troy. And so I could sneak in before the tourists got in, and I could go to areas that were closed off. And I would scoop in the debris thousands and thousands of scallops just to show you the beachfront aspect of Troy. But unfortunately, Troy looks like a beach ship today. It stands up where you would expect water to be, but all there is dirt, right? And you have to travel about, I would think it's about 7 or 8 kilometers now to get to where the Greeks had beached their ships. And to show why Troy was so important was because it commanded the entrance from the Aegean to the Black Sea. And at the point where it's called the Dardanelles is very narrow. And I sat up on a pillbox and watched that all the ships had to go in single file because the straits were so narrow. So Troy commanded that area. And we know how important that area is even today because we have that great fight in the Ukraine. This is the breadbasket of antiquity, and this is also the breadbasket of today.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And so Troy commanded the entrance and exit, and so therefore was extremely coveted and extremely powerful.
Yes, and because of deforestation largely in the watershed above Troy, the removal of trees, it caused erosion and siltation that actually filled in the beachfront area and moved the beach away from Troy by, as you mentioned, several kilometers today. So Troy, right?
Yeah, well, actually, this happened not only with Troy, but also with the very famous city of Ephesus. And I have these maps that show exactly the change over time in the book from the fact that upstream, and this is actually, I never thought of this, but the problem is people upstream don't give a damn about people downstream, right? So they're cutting the wood upstream, and where the siltation goes, it's not going to my house, right? And so they don't care that they're transforming these great ports into landlocked areas.
Yes. And John, a related problem that you discuss is not just siltation and the alluviation, it's called, of soil particles into areas that were formerly water, but also salinization of cropland. Can you say a little about how that happens and why that affected these ancient cities?
Well, this was endemic to Mesopotamia. What happened, once again, there was no forethought. Gilgamesh thought he had really was really a dude, right? He cut down the cedar forest and created a huge city in Uruk. What he didn't realize was that what followed the logs going downstream were great amounts of sediment that had tremendous amounts of salts in them. And so over time, his great empire fell because it's very difficult to grow food in salty marshes.
Yes, and the water will actually leach salts out of rocks and soil, and then salt has to go somewhere. And if it settles on your farmland, it becomes infertile.
Once again, you have this movement because of these catastrophes. So southern Mesopotamia lost its power, and it moved northward to places like Assyria, and places like Mari became more important.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about shipping in maritime trade and warfare, and why forests were so important there. Folks don't often realize that these ancient civilizations achieved dominance or conquest through shipping, and that depended on trees in more ways than we might think of. Can you say a little about that, the ways that masts, for instance, played a role?
Well, actually, I'd like to talk first of all about the importance of wood for roads. The great roads of Rome, what you had underneath the rock bed were a plethora of wood to keep the rocks from sinking. And you had this also in the roads leading from the eastern United States, for example, Connecticut to the Ohio. They called them plank roads.
Right.
Because, rains fall, the soil gets muddy, and you can't get overland, right? So here you have the wood road and you have the wood carriage, right? So it's wood. And then we'll talk about the seas. The great power of Athens, for example, depended on its access to forests. In fact, the area northward, which was called Amphipolis, was so significant that the Greeks were willing to lose about 30,000 people to conquer it.
Mm-hmm.
And what actually led to the Athenian downfall was the fact that they lost access to the great northern woods above them. And what made, for example, Alexander the Great was the fact Macedonia was the great timber center of that area. So, and actually, once the Greeks were losing their wood, they looked towards, of all places, I mean, people laugh at me, but of Italy, right, of Sicily, which there's nary a tree there now for their building their great fleets to fight in, for example, the Peloponnesian Wars. And so you have the formation, what they call Magna Graecia, which is Greater Greece, which was both in Sicily and in southern Italy. And it was all available because they wanted control of the woods. In fact, Rome has, the story of the founding of Rome is all based on wood. The Remus and Romulus, right? They were wood. Remus was fed. Romulus was fed by Remus the wolf, and actually, Italy near Rome had such an immense forest that the government forbade people to go into it because they feared they would be lost. And I told this tale to an Italian friend of mine who actually helped edit the book, and he just laughed in my face because there's not even a stump left, right?
That's the Avernian wood you're referring to, isn't it?
No, that's a Chimean forest.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I'd love to talk about the Avernian woods. It means birdless, and the reason why it was birdless was it was so thick a forest, and that's by Naples. And I took my son to visit Pompeii, and where is the wood?
Mm-hmm.
Where is the forest?
A lot of these places have never recovered from deforestation in ancient times, folks.
Well, actually, all the mountains are called Mount Idas all over the Mediterranean, which means in Greek wood mountain.
Okay.
But there's no wood there now. And it's sort of like in ancient Chinese times, which is also discussed in the book, you had New Mountain, which was described by Mencius as a mountain that was not a mountain because he said all mountains naturally have trees and New Mountain has no trees. And why do they have no trees? Because people went and chopped down the trees and then they sent their animals in to eat the saplings and eat the seeds. And so you have this, no matter what group of people, what ethnicity, we all have this very, you might say, troubling relationship with the forests.
Yeah. John, at the end of the Bronze Age, the shortage of fuel for smelting had become so acute that metal workers turned to iron, ushering in the Iron Age. Can you relate a little about how that transition came about? Why civilization moved from bronze to iron, and how that affected forests?
Well, the copper ore that they were using for the main ingredient for bronze actually contained more iron ore than copper ore. So it was, you might say, more efficient use of, say, the available wood to smelt to get the iron out. But also, you could actually mechanically remove the iron. And so people began slowly, just like with once again with wood handled tools, right, to remove the iron from the rock, and so this led to the Iron Age. But what's also was fascinating me was I got this email about 2 years ago from an archaeological group in the Max Planck Institute that they were stimulated by a forest journey to go really look at what kind of fuel people were using if they were running out of wood. And what they discovered was that in turns in the Peloponnesian area of Greece, and also in Konya in Crete, began burning fossil fuels, coal, for the first time ever. And this pushed back the use of fossil fuels 2,000 years that people really had not conceived before. And so I actually have all that discussion by the new archaeology discoveries in the new edition of A Forest Journey. And I'd like to tell the audience that it's not just a page or a sentence here and there that was changed. We have 160 more pages in the new version.
Much thicker. One of the new sections in your book sets forth the development of steel in Africa, in places such as modern-day Togo and Mali. And there, too, the evidence points to the creation of derived savannas on account of deforestation to feed ironworks. Can you say a little about how this pattern played out in ways that were similar to or different than in other civilizations in that part of the world?
Well, I when I was researching the first book, I knew a little bit about Togo, but not sufficient to make it into the book. But I was talking to this one Togo metallurgical archaeologist, and he said you should talk to Peter Schmidt. He made some major discoveries, and what he discovered was that by Lake Victoria, 1,000 years before the Europeans ever discovered how to make steel, these people were making steel, and it goes against the white racist notion that Africa is a dark continent. In fact, they developed into not only the Iron Age, but the Steel Age long before the West. But this also, just like the West, caused a great changes in the forest lands because you need vast fuels to create this iron. And so they basically develop various more efficient ways of creating the iron. However, they had to stop several hundred years at a time because running out of wood. Because the fact is, not only do you smelt the iron, but then you have the iron tools, which you can then, destroy more forests, and right. You can, farm. And what happened, for example, in Togo was that about the 17th century, 18th century, people started running out of fuel for the iron. And iron means power, whether you're white or black or you're Asian, people, we're all people, and civilizations, you might say, get their fuel on power. And so the African ruling classes wanted to continue their power, and their power came from iron. So what they did was they traded people, slaves, for European iron. In fact, they found several shipwrecks that were coming from Sweden to supply the Togo with iron because of the deforestation that the iron industry created. Anywhere you have iron, you lose forests. In fact, Ovid, centuries before, talked about how in the Iron Age, all the pine trees leave the hilltops.
Okay, let's fast. I see Paula. Can't hear you, Paula.
I'm going to jump in for a minute with two questions, and also to move us towards audience questions because
Sure.
Obviously this conversation could go on, and
maybe we could have
I
part
wish it
one,
could.
part two, part three, part four, every week, right?
Right. But here are my two questions.
Sure.
At what point did you start to think about the implications of this for us in this current day, whatever we want to call it, civilization? And secondly, when did biotic pump understanding bring you to a rewrite of the book?
Well, let me answer one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
In 1989, when the first edition was published, the main concern was over tropical forests rather than, and also around the accessibility of fuel in the world, rather than the conversation hadn't really begun that greatly about carbon dioxide. And also in 1989, you didn't have what was called the development of the new forestry. And the new forestry, which has permeated the schools, at least in North America, is that trees are more significant than just for building and for basically for building. And also understanding came that old growth, the problem was everybody was anthropomorphizing trees until 1990, that a young tree is much more vigorous, so it takes in more carbon, and an old tree is decrepit and needs to go to the rest home, right? And can't take in very much carbon. And it turned out to be just the opposite, that the older a tree is allowed to grow, the greater carbon it sequesters. And not only does it sequester it, but it holds it into the biomass. So that was one aspect that hit me. And then perusing the new developments was the fact that forests are more valuable, are as valuable, I should say, for not only holding and sequestering carbon, but also for the integrity of the weather of the world. And this was slowly beginning to hit the various foresters, the more progressive foresters, especially people like Doug Scheel, who helped me out. And what they discuss is, first of all, that the idea, and still people hold it, that we get all our rain from evaporation of ocean water. What the new discovery was that we get a high percentage, like up to 40, 50% of our precipitation from evapotranspiration of leaves. And not only that aspect, but also the trees create a relay of precipitation, say from Scandinavia and Siberia all the way to China, as one example. Or another example, from the Congo Basin to the Nile. So if you get rid of those trees, what are people going to be able to drink? And so,
Oh, grow.
or grow, yeah, or any, we are what the biggest problem on this planet is we don't realize is that we're just another critter, and we need the clouds, we need the forests to survive. And so these issues entered into a stimulation for a whole new part of the book, but also other aspects like, for example, that forests allow for the migration of birds. I couldn't believe, I mean, it blew me out that the hummingbird, for example, they travel like 10,000 miles in a season. They go all the way from Central America to Alaska, for example, and we require hummingbirds and other birds to pollinate, and we also require birds to get rid of pests that prevent the trees for growing, and also the discovery that the soil in the boreal forests, for example, which have been greatly ignored, the boreal forest over the tropical forest, the boreal forest, it contains a great amounts of carbon in the soil. And not only that, but the aerosols that the leaves create to cool down the earth. One aspect that I think was really interesting is people talked about clearing the boreal forest so you would have a better albedo. But what they didn't take into consideration was all the services, you might say, that forest creates. And so all of these newly discovered, and I'd like to say also human health, how we're dependent on the forest as social distancers. In fact, one of the great stimulations for me to write the new portions of the book was that I came across in 2018 an amazing journal article called Bats, Deforestation, and Coronaviruses. And so this, I could talk for hours about this, but I just like to say these were the aspects that said, John, you've got to write all this new material down because people need to know that at one time we that the wood built civilization, and now we have to keep the forest intact to save it.
Thanks, John. I'm going to go off screen again because Paul has audience questions to ask you. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Let me look at some of the questions the audience has turned in. Can you talk about the history of non-native invasive species changing the forests? In Maryland today, for example, non-native invasive vines are the second largest cause of native tree loss.
Yeah, I mean, in the hills of Santa Barbara, you see this fight all the time, say between the native lupins and the what we call the wild oat. This is a big problem of stuff people brought into the forest. Just like in Florida, we have the problem about the various pythons, for example, that people have brought in, and so we have to clear the land of the invasive species to allow the trees to proliferate.
I want to turn to a slightly upbeat area that your book touches on, which is voices of conservation, and this is my framing. We sometimes tend to think that advocates of restraint and wise use of resources only arose in recent times, but you cite many examples in your book of historians, philosophers, politicians, and others that decried the waste and destruction of forests and were making scientific and sophisticated arguments almost identical to those that we make today. For example, ancient Greek philosopher Plato, reading from your book, wrote you wrote that he gave forests a major role in his utopia, in his vision of what Attica looked like in its pristine state. Quote, the country was unimpaired. It had much forest land in its mountains, and besides, there were many lofty trees of cultivated species. The canopy of the woodlands protected the rich earth covering these hills from the erosive action of deluges prevalent at the time, and allowed the country to turn to good use the yearly rain from Zeus, not as now wasting what flows from bare ground to the sea. And one more shorter quote that I want to point out in the book is from Cicero, the famous Roman statesman and orator who blasted one of the tribunes, Servilius Rullus, saying, he is a luxurious rake who sells his forests before his vineyards. So this is a little shout out to our activist friends in Napa County who are fighting against completely rampant and unregulated high-end resort and winery development at the cost of deforesting oak woodlands there. No thought to the water. John, can you say a little about, has conservationists always been around since the beginning of time? Because that's my view of it. There have always been people there who cared and tried to push back against destruction.
Well, bless you for the question, because it all began with Gilgamesh about 8 years ago, and this is why I think one of the necessities for a new version of Forest Journey is that there was a new tablet found. It's called the Ecological Gilgamesh, where the writer gives the forest life. It's not some dark, dreary place. It's full of like monkeys screaming. It's full of bugs, humming, and like a symphony. And as Gilgamesh cut down the trees, and I already mentioned this, but this is how I end the book, is they're on like a timber raft, right? And Enkidu looks at Gilgamesh and says, I think we've transformed the forest into a wasteland. And then he looks at Gilgamesh and says, what will our gods think? So, I mean, that's the beginning of the environmental ethics right there. And then you get with, for example, like you mentioned, Plato, where he describes that because of deforestation, the soil in Attica now is like a skeleton of an animal with all the fine meat removed. And then in Greece, too, we had the advent of the sacred groves where people were forbidden to enter and mess with the trees. And there's one great tale that I like to just touch on. Oh, you have this rabid forest hater who's cutting down all the trees and suddenly gets the ire of Ceres, the goddess of abundance, and she sends him a curse that no matter how much he eats, he'll never be satiated. And so he eats the whole world to scarcity and can find no food left. And so he ends up eating himself, which I think is a parable for today. So, yes. Those are examples. I could go on and on.
Yeah. There's so much that you touch on that we won't have time for, but I did want to touch on the early American colonial period. You discuss quite a bit about the increasing tension between Britain and its colonies, where the forests were here in New England. And they were used, among other things, for sourcing masts. Bigger masts meant bigger ships, more freight, more velocity for the ships.
No, what they meant, no, actually what they meant was more guns. More, you had like these ships that had like 200, 300 guns on them, but you needed to balance them, as they were called ships of the line, where the ships would line up in a line opposing each other, and they'd let off like 280, 300 guns, right? And if you didn't have huge intact mass, not wood that's pasted to adhered together for balance, right? As the ricochets of the guns blew, and there were no masts to be found, masting timber to be found, because what happened was, and this is like sort of like what happens in the Straits of Hormuz, is the English were getting most of their masts from Scandinavia, but the Scandinavians decided they wouldn't send any more. Mm-hmm. And so the only place the English could access were the white pines of New England. And we have, for example, a diary where the masting ships, there were regular masting ships, just like oil tankers, going from New England to England, and they failed to arrive because of heavy seas, and the head of the Navy was having an ulcer over the possibility of not being able to mast the English Navy. In fact, the reason why Americans won the Revolution was over masting timber, was because they realized that England depended on their area for masts. So what they said, well, why should we send it to England? Why don't we just create our own Navy, right? And so we can, have independence. And Cornwallis, if everyone remembers, was caught in a naval blockade. I believe it was in Virginia. And the English, because they were kept out of the masting timber areas that they once held by the American revolutionaries, they couldn't resupply Cornwallis, and the end result was the creation of our country.
Yeah, and I wanted to segue into that a second, because it struck me too when you noted that just a few chops of an axe could ruin a mast tree. And that was kind of a profound thought, that it was very easy to damage a strategic resource back then with a few chops of an axe. You mentioned the pine tree riot, you discussed that, and the cat and mouse regulatory efforts between the regulators that were sent over from Parliament to try to enforce what sound like fairly common sense rules to protect forests against the depredations of local profit-interested colonialists. And they ultimately were engaged in a futile quest, doomed from the very beginning. Could you say a little bit more about how forests may have played a role in the tension between the colonies in Britain that led to the revolution?
Very simply, the English wanted large trees for masting. The colonists wanted large trees for lumber. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, if you were going to start a farm, the first piece of equipment you put in was a sawmill. And what did the sawmill require? It required the devouring of the masting timber the English needed. And so the first seed of revolution happened in the backwoods of Maine, New Hampshire, and northern Massachusetts, where the English attempted to guard the masting timber, and the Americans got dressed up just like for the Tea Party as Indians and attacked the British soldiers who were protecting or confiscating, I should say, the material from the sawmills. And so this created the first, I would say, the first stab of revolution in the United States.
Yes, the so-called pine tree riot took place in
the pine tree. I love the pine tree. I love the pine tree riot because everybody gives so much play to the Boston Tea Party. But actually, the pine tree riot was as significant, and it was also covered in the colonial newspapers, where the British once again wanted the sawmills to be shut down, and the Americans, that's how they were going to make their fortunes. And so when you try to step on someone's fortune, you definitely get a fight. And so you had this great riot where they took the sheriff and basically flogged him. And as I said, what did they say? They call it painting in stripes.
Running him out of town on the rail, tarring and feathering. Is that what
Oh yeah, tarred and feather. The Americans were gnarly people.
Yeah.
They didn't want their fortunes to be messed with because they were able to finance their farms, for example. Well, you had required a lot of capital expenditures to start a farm. And so if you had a sawmill and you were able to cut down these great trees and turn them into lumber, there was great demand at what's called the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, because they had all been deforested for processing sugar and for clearing the land for sugar crops. And so they depended on the colonies for a great trade in timber, in lumber, and people made their fortunes in lumber, and they didn't want their fortunes to be liquidated by the English needs.
Yes, and they were not necessarily motivated by conservationist goals. There was corruption, there was self-dealing, and the courts that a lot of the colonial powers like Britain depended on for justice in the colonies were run by judges who ran sawmills. And so
right. I mean, it's like the typical conflicts today, right? In the Supreme Court, right? You have these people who are run by, by profit. And so they're not going to like stamp on their money making, because it seems to me in our society, making money is a big aspect.
John, I'm going to read a question to you from the audience too. Have you ever seen evidence of a failing society attempting reforestation? If yes, what were the results?
Let's see. I talked about the sacred groves. Was an attempt to reforest, but the fact is because so much of the outside area had been deforested, people began to attack the sacred groves, and they didn't give a fig about whether they were disturbing the gods, because they wanted to be able to have warm homes at night.
I hate to step in here, but because clearly you could go on, and much of our audience has stayed with us.
Oh, great.
So two things. There is also an example which I intended to put into resources of deforestation, the Tijuca story, which was told by Tom Garreau at our first conference about the deforestation, I believe, of a significant mountain outside of what became Rio, and their discovery that they didn't have water anymore. And so they did a major reforestation of that mountain, and their water returned. But the other thing is that there was a question asking about the last question that came in on chat asks if you could talk about, for example, the coastal Salish people and other indigenous groups that had a very different ethic and relationship with the forests that they lived in.
Well, I don't want to create a lot of controversy, but I guess I will. Because first of all, the term indigenous is a false concept, because except for maybe the original Africans, the Homo sapien in Africa, were all like immigrants. And so even the Clovis man, for example, who were the first entrants into North America, they caused mass extinction of the larger mammals. And you take the Algonquin in Indians, say in New England, they loved to have huge fires in wintertime to stay warm, and they didn't give a fig about conservation because they liked to sleep naked. And so every 4 or 5 years, they had to move to a different forest. In fact, the reason why you could not Christianize the Iroquois was because the Jesuits said that there was an eternal flame in hell, and they laughed at them because they knew from their own experience that they would have lost all their forests with an eternal flame. And so we are human beings. For example, another example is the Aboriginal in Australia, totally changed the whole ecology of northern Australia from a rainforest to a eucalyptus forest because we're all humans, and no matter where we are, who we are, the one thing we do know how to do is make fire. In fact, there is no group in the world that is human that does not know how to make fire. In fact, that is the single defining trait of our species. And that's why you get such a legend of Prometheus, who steals, fire for humanity. And then the gods, torture him for creating humanity into gods.
Thank you, John Perlin. Thank you, Paul Hughes. This has been a wonderful presentation and discussion.